Hello. This presentation covers the chapter on the American musical comedy from Leonard Bernstein's book, The Joy of Music. This chapter is basically the script from Season 5, Episode 1 of The Omnibus, a television program that ran from 1952 to 1961 that featured educational discussions about everything from science to the arts. This is one of a handful of episodes hosted by Leonard Bernstein and in my opinion is highly entertaining. It aired on October 7th, 1956. Let's look at some clips spliced together from the introduction.
Happy Valentine's, and the morning light, the guys in the horse and bike.
Make up your mind to have no regret. I could have done tonight. I could have done tonight.
This is the glittering world of musical theater. In that vast field of musical theater, we can discern a continuum, a kind of ruler, by which we can mark off the differences between one show and another, with variety show at one end and grand opera at the other. Now, between these two poles of variety and grand opera, we can account for every other form.
As you might have been able to tell in the short clips I just provided, Bernstein quickly shows us a continuum between the two poles of the variety show and opera, and explains two main differences between the two. The first is the difference of intention. Opera's intentions are to artistically entertain, while variety shows are strictly just to entertain. The second is the difference of kind. Operas tell stories and further plots through the use of music, whereas variety shows are just packaged collections of songs, dances, and anything entertaining with no unifying thread. The other forms mentioned in the clip are more like opera if they try to tell a story through music, and more like a variety show if that's not the case. So how does a plot get furthered by music? Well, that's by a number of ways, but the main one that Bernstein highlights is through the use of the recitative. The function of the recitative is to set up the situation for a song. Bernstein shows us how to do this in different operatic styles of famous opera composers, and his subject matter is the scenario of his wife and him telling his wife about the rise in the price of chicken. Bernstein tells us that no matter how heartbreakingly he tells about the price of chicken, the song is what's going to get the attention, and that's what the recitative leads us into. The recitative is discussed to give some light background on opera, since American musical comedies are found in the middle ground between that and the variety show. This allows Bernstein to segue into the evolution of the American musical comedy. He starts with The Black Crook, which is historically considered to be the first American musical comedy, because of an accident where a German play which contained no music at all was merged with a French ballet company to provide a theater for both. As Bernstein puts it, The Black Crook was attached to song and dance with spit and chewing gum, fusing plot with ballet with American comedy songs. At that time, anything good in art had to be foreign, so that aspect had a lot to do with why people loved The Black Crook, according to Bernstein, even though it was 5.5 hours long and pretty bland compared to musicals of today. Which leads us into another step in the right direction, A Trip to Chinatown. This show, from about 1890, proved that a musical could have an American story. It also showed people talking like everyday Americans, or speech in the vernacular. However, a big component that A Trip to Chinatown was missing was the use of integration, songs written for the plot. Bernstein goes on to explain what an operetta is, since that's also a huge piece of the American musical comedy puzzle. Operettas boomed around the turn of the 20th century, and were different from what musical theater was at the time. They were exotic, using un-American plots and unnatural, elegant language. and their characters were unfamiliar and unrelatable to Americans. Musical theater was in the heyday of the variety show, burlesque, and the revue. Revue's main contributions to the American musical comedy was the use of the musical vernacular, or jazz in our case. Even though revues are a collection of songs without a story, integration was starting to happen, acting as a unified thread to hold acts together, whether that be through the same theme of location or something else. Revues also introduced satire into theaters, sketches that spoof situations and parodies of new fads and local jokes. At this point, Bernstein begins relating musical theater as a growing boy in his adolescence, the 1920s. Accomplishments in this time period include the acceptance of plot into musical entertainment, the acceptance of American themes, talk and music in the vernacular, and a sense of variety within unity. He touches back on how integration of music into the plot was starting to happen, but at the same time not completely how it should be, referencing Gershwin's "Someone to Watch Over Me" from OK. He explains his suspicions of why he feels that the song was written before the book and fit in later, quoting specific lyrics from the song to back up his point. The stock market crash of 1929 is brought up, as well as the Great Depression, and how both affected musical theater then. The production of movies with sound also came into effect, and Bernstein refers to the 1930s as musical theater's sober, young adulthood. Government and social satires begin to start appearing in musicals as they did in revues. This leads us into Of Thee I Sing, what Bernstein refers to as the culmination of the American musical comedy. Even though it uses brilliant operetta techniques like underscoring and counterpoint, and has a very similar first act finale to The Mikado, which is a comic opera, it is still an American musical comedy because of the fact that it's 1. American themed, 2. The characters are not remote nor are they exotic, and 3. It's verbally and musically in the vernacular. Bernstein then goes on to tell us that shows like Showboat and The King and I are actually operettas and not American musical comedies. His reasoning for this, let's use Showboat as an example, is because even though it has an American theme, it uses a regional language, Southern dialect from Mississippi. The proper language must be that of familiar American speech, and furthermore, they must use jazz to be considered an American musical comedy. Bernstein then referenced Cole Porter's Du Barry Was a Lady, which is foreign in theme, but not an operetta because of the use of jazz and the American language vernacular. Through the merging of operetta with revue techniques, orchestrators and arrangers started being needed to supplement what the songwriters were doing for interludes, overtures, and things like that. Ballet and dances also began being incorporated a whole lot more, and plot dancing begins to be a regular part of the whole musical. Bernstein credits the success of musicals to the American creative spirit. Each new musical is a surprise, and with an increase in talent, people like Rodgers and Hammerstein could then take the best elements of opera, operetta, vaudeville, and revues and blend them together. Recitatives also make transitions from scene to song very smooth in musicals. Bernstein closes his work on the American musical comedy by saying that we're in a historical period, in 1956, like Mozart was in 1750, using Singspiel to propel opera into what it later came to be. Bernstein says that all they need now is for our Mozart to come along, to get us into a new form. This is a good time to reference Humphrey Burton's biography, which states that Bernstein was right about a new form. That new form appeared as West Side Story, according to Burton. Now begins my critique by first critiquing Burton's biography. On page 264 of Burton's biography, before stating that West Side Story was kind of the stepping stone for this new form, Burton says that the form relies heavily on an element Bernstein hardly ever mentions in his TV show: dance used to creatively tell a story. This is false in my opinion because Bernstein talked a lot about the inclusion of ballet in some of these musicals from the very beginning of his TV program. He even brings up the importance of choreography and plot dancing on page 186. Also, is West Side Story an American musical comedy? According to Bernstein's rules for it, it's not. The language vernacular is not an easy American speech pattern, even though it is in English, just like Showboat. Bernstein argued that Showboat's vernacular was in Southern dialect, so is a Puerto Rican or Italian dialect acceptable? Even though jazz is used all the way throughout West Side Story, I just feel like some of these are points to bring up, and it brings me to my next critique of Bernstein. I don't agree with Bernstein's justification of Showboat being an operetta or Du Barry Was a Lady being a truly American musical comedy, because his reasoning isn't clear. He tells us that to be a musical comedy it must be American themed, characters must be remote or exotic, and music and language must be in the American vernacular. Bernstein basically tells us that if the theme isn't American, but everything else is how it should be, it can still be an American musical comedy, like with Du Barry Was a Lady. But if jazz isn't used as with Showboat, even though it's American themed, and even though the Southern dialect is signature to the country of which we're discussing musical comedies, it can't be an American musical comedy. Of course, if Ethel Merman is a part of this and no other requirements apply, it's still an American musical comedy just because she's a part of it, according to Bernstein. There's not enough consistency with those rules, so I don't buy into that. But I do appreciate Bernstein attempting to break this all down, even though it's slightly confusing. I feel like I have a much better understanding of musicals from reading this chapter in The Joy of Music. I also think that Bernstein does a great job of showcasing the various types of musical theater and how we got to where we are today, or 1956.